Well, Whitney, I know that we, have discussed it, but I would love for you to, share with the attendees a little bit about. I know your background is super unique and I find quite interesting. So I would love for you to introduce yourself, introduce a little bit about Northwestern Mutual, and we can dive into some of the more structured questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so I, like a lot of people who work in the social space, I have kind of an unusual path that took me to get here. So I started out, 20 some odd years ago on the PR side, but then actually took a hard left and became a lawyer. So after, working as a lawyer for a few years, really felt that that wasn't kind of going to bring me professional fulfillment. And so started looking elsewhere, and actually through entrepreneurship, founded my own startup. And as part of that role, really took on all of the marketing and CMO responsibilities for that startup. That's what led me back into the marketing world. And so from there, after selling my startup, jumped into tech marketing, and that's kind of what brought me up until today. But what's really interesting, and why I was so excited to see this particular topic for a panel, was that the last three companies I've worked at, IBM, Hilton, and now Northwestern Mutual, have all been around for over 100 years. So this idea of, a really strong legacy company is one that clearly I must enjoy, because I keep hopping to them. And I think the challenge of bringing social, a newer medium, to those established brands is really exciting.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, as we discussed, Northwestern Mutual, they've certainly earned their spot, being a legacy brand and being around for 165 years. Can you set the scene a little bit for us and share a little bit more about, you had mentioned being referred to as a quiet company. And I'd love for you to talk a
Yeah.
little bit more about that and how that sort of, rooted itself and played in the origin story that it has today.
Absolutely. So Northwestern Mutual has been around for over 165 years, which is just kind of mind blowing to me. And what I think is so interesting is that marketing, direct to consumer marketing, wasn't really a big part of their focus until really just the last decade or so. It had earned this nickname as the quiet company, because the idea was, if you needed the types of financial planning and insurance services that we provided, you would hear about it through word of mouth. Someone would pass you the name of their financial advisor on the golf course, or you would hear about it at church or a book club, or ask your parents who their financial advisor was. So it grew for decades and decades and decades without needing large scale advertising campaigns. And I think the really interesting part of that strength, anytime you have a company that has really built on that word of mouth, that you have the basics of a really strong product, right? And it's just a matter of then, actually getting the marketing to showcase that strength that you're already building on top of. So it's been a really exciting challenge for me in order to bring Northwestern Mutual onto social and how we appear and play in the social space, because it's a lot like having the resources and legacy and history of a big company, but in a lot of ways also having kind of feeling like a startup, because we are actually still defining out kind of foundational things about our social program. One of the projects that we actually just did this past year was a 100+ page social playbook, where we really dive very deep into who is our social audience respective. We all have our segments as an overall marketing company, but who are we really focusing in on social specifically? How do we talk to them? How does our social tone of voice differ from our overall brand tone of voice? What colors do we maybe use on social to differentiate and break up our feed that we may not use on our regular everyday stationery? So just kind of redefining all of those basic foundational elements has been a great process for us. And I think it's so neat to have the resources of the big company, but also get to do that invention type work.
Absolutely. And I know, that social playbook is going to, take a huge role as you all move forward and develop the strategy. I know that you've put a ton of work in over the past 8 months. So it will be really interesting to learn more about how, being in a highly regulated industry, of course, there are guardrails that you have to work in. But can you talk a little bit about how that's, you know, worked internally with the legal team and making sure that you're being able to be creative, but and obviously engaging the audience, but still keeping the peace with all the stakeholders over at internally.
Yeah, so this is where it does come in helpful that I actually am a lawyer myself. I've always approached at any company the legal team and other kind of stakeholders that we have is they're not there to prevent you from doing, whatever it is that you're seeking out to do. They want the company to be just as successful as you do. And so a lot of times it's just a matter of educating them on what controls are available, why you would want to go after a certain thing. And so I approach our compliance folks and our legal folks with, if I just give them the information for the why, then they will help me figure out how to get to a yes. And I think just reframing that relationship as not an adversarial one, but as a supportive relationship, I think really helps. And especially in a heavily regulated industry like finance, it's definitely useful to be able to just go back and understand where they're coming from too, reading the actual regulations on what counts as an advertisement and how that affects, what you're allowed to put out, what our field representatives are able to put out, kind of going back to the basics of the world they're playing from. So then you both have that mutual understanding of what the other's motivation is. It really helps you get to that point of agreement.
Absolutely. And of course, your background on the legal side of things, I'm sure, is helpful for you too, to really understand where they're coming from.
Yeah, it is. I would say too, I think that I've been in a lot of companies where people don't realize you can actually say no to your lawyers, right? You can say, actually, I want to accept the risk and we should go for this thing anyway. The lawyers are there to advise you. They're there to give you guardrails. But, I think it's always worth having the discussion of like, if what we want to do is worth it, we can figure out creative ways to get there. And just because the first idea doesn't work out, there's always, a way to get to a yes, even if it's not the way that you originally maybe thought of it.
For sure. Yeah. And I think, I've worked on a ton of highly regulated, influencer programs and all of that. And I find one of the most important aspects is, first of all, understanding compliance and regulations that the platforms have in place. And then, of course, where you're allowed to play on your end. And of course, just setting those expectations, both with your legal team, them setting them, on your side, and then also communicating that to the influencers. So can you talk a little bit about how you're keeping up to date with those changes? Social platforms are changing constantly, and how you're keeping organized and ensuring that all of those regulations are communicated over to the influencers.
Yeah, so influencers are actually a pretty exciting part of our overall social strategy at Northwestern Mutual. And a lot of people are surprised to hear that. They think, well, like, how do you show someone doing financial planning with like a beauty influencer or something? But it's so important to us to be able to showcase the human side of the financial planning process. A lot of people, especially millennials, have a lot of fear or guilt or shame built into their financial background. They think, oh, I took out too many student loans in college, or I made some bad credit card decisions when I was younger. And I wish I could have bought a house, but I didn't have the down payment until just recently, or things like that. And so they think that they are not actually, they don't know that they can be helped by having a financial advisor. They think of it as something that maybe only older, wealthier people actually participate in. And so the way that we use influencers really allows us to break down those barriers and showcase how real people work through real everyday financial situations with their advisor. And so when we bring on influencers, we find it really important to make sure every single influencer we work with actually has a meeting with a real Northwestern Mutual financial representative to talk through their financial plan, so that they understand and can speak authentically about what that planning experience is like. And oftentimes it's funny because we have seen time and time again that influencers that we have brought on and taken through that process actually end up turning into clients afterwards, because they realize how beneficial it can be for, especially at a career like content creation, that often has, a lot of different odd income streams and stuff. They really value their time to talk with the advisors. And so that's part of it, just having that initial meeting to guarantee authenticity. And then we also work with, a influencer agency, much like the one you work for, that, helps us to make sure that we're communicating all of those contractual compliance things, keeps on top of the project management. Having a partner when you're working with influencers is so valuable. I think it would take so many people if we tried to do this on our own in-house, that having an influencer agency to help support us is something that I highly recommend if you're able to.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge undertaking, and having those, extra folks in place certainly is helpful. I think what would be interesting for me to understand is, as you've worked with influencers and built out this team and worked with your agency partner, what are some of the surprises that have come across your table in terms of influencers that have performed really well, or verticals that you maybe had to fight for a little bit to bring into a program that ended up, whether it be converting or driving a ton of website traffic? Can you tell us some of those stories?
Yeah, so we really think of social and especially organic social, boosted social influencers as upper funnel tactics. And so we focus more along things around awareness, engagements, and brand health metrics. So when we're looking at, do we want to pull this lever or this lever in terms of what marketing tactics we're going to deploy, we have tried to get really precise in what can be expected from any sort of execution. And the only way that you can do that is by looking to the data. So we've done I've been at Northwestern Mutual about 8 months now. In that time, we've already conducted 2 brand health studies, so that we can say, pretty authoritatively, like, if we do this, it's going to result in this for us. And when we work in social, when we do things like boosted, when we work with influencers, we're seeing comparable or even better in a lot of cases impacts on our high level awareness and consideration brand health metrics as compared to other more traditional tactics. We see influencers, for example, drives consideration for us at a much, much higher rate than traditional linear TV, for example, which is kind of surprising because you think of the amazing reach of something like linear TV, but with influencers, we are able to just make that really strong impression because people who are following that influencer already have that established trust, and it just really breaks through even more than traditional tactics.
Yeah, and I think from a credibility standpoint, they've already amassed this audience and they have a little bit of authority, to have these discussions, especially with education that you guys have provided. I'm wondering, there are certain instances where communication or conversations really make sense coming from the brand's voice, and in other cases, influencers can do a much better job of driving that consideration. So, are there, examples or situations where communication makes a lot more sense coming from the influencer, and then are there situations where you decide to pull back and focus a little bit more on brand direct messaging, depending on whether it be the pillar or the offering that you guys are pushing?
I think it's just authenticity is important no matter kind of where it comes from. And so a lot of what we do when we work with influencers is they're still telling the overall same message that we may have for our campaign. For example, right now in market, we have a campaign that is all about financial wellness, and the idea that financial wellness is just as critical to your overall health as physical wellness, physical fitness, emotional well-being. Financial wellness is so critical, because if you don't have it, it creates anxiety, it creates stress, and that trickles down into your overall wellness. So, we have those high level brand messages that are going out via, all kinds of different channels, our email channels, our display, traditional digital channels, things like that. But then with influencers, we're able to just tweak it a little bit. So we're still going after how we tell that very human story, but by working with fitness and wellness influencers. And so they then get to shed their light on it. They're already experts in that fitness and wellness field. And so they can say, hey, I've studied fitness, I've studied wellness my whole life, and I can tell you my personal story of how this does connect into your overall wellness and how important it is to put your finances, just as important as you would, going to the gym every week or something. So that, I think, is how we bring them in. It's not about the influencers telling a different story than what we're telling at the brand level. It's just making sure that no matter who is communicating it, it's authentic.
Absolutely. And you mentioned studies a little bit earlier, so I'd love to dive into that, because understanding obviously where influencers are driving that consideration is quite important to you all. Can you speak to any specific tools or studies that you use to follow the consumer's journey through the cycle, whether it be, moving them from an investment customer over to an insurance customer? And then also how you leverage paid media tactics, retargeting. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mentioned this earlier, but I'm kind of a data geek. Definitely love to be tracking that at pretty much all stages that we can. Obviously, it's getting more challenging with changes in different platforms to do really full journey tracking of an individual from the very first, marketing touch you have with them to when they end up, becoming a client. So we look at it from a variety of different sources and try and paint that kind of multi-touch or, MMA version of like what that journey looks like. So we have a great data and insights team that we rely on that really looks at the customer and what they're experiencing. They do all of our segmentation and kind of more traditional things like focus groups or surveys. So we take that piece of it. Then we have our analytics team who is really looking at, from a CRM perspective, of like, who is coming into our website, what are they doing when they get there, what pages are they visiting, and how does that affect their overall journey? What are the conversion rates, all of that. And then also we're looking at those brand health studies that I mentioned earlier. Website traffic alone doesn't paint the total picture, but because someone doesn't necessarily, especially in financial services, they're not going to see a tweet and think, hey, I'm moving my entire life savings over to that company based on a tweet, right? They're going to do research. And so knowing that having a really strong brand awareness, having really strong preference and advocacy with our existing customers, all of those kind of things that are studied through traditional brand lift studies, Nielsen studies, things like that, those are equally important to getting that full picture of how our marketing is working, and then trying to pull them all together to tell that comprehensive story of, how we're doing. So we use a lot of those. Sometimes I know it can be challenging to be like, I'm doing reporting again for hours on end. But I think having that data at the end of the day, it makes us smarter marketers. It makes us just better at what we're doing.
Absolutely. And I think it would be great to hear, what advice or methods can you share that have helped, to prove that success? And I know that you said it's been 8 months. And so you focused a lot of your attention initially on building out, the social playbook. And now we're starting to collect data and really understand what is and is not working, which influencers are really driving some of those, upper funnel conversations. And so when we look at success, obviously it varies by company, also by, place that you are within the organization. So budget approvals really can be, different across the board. But I think for a lot of folks here, we have conversations about a full funnel strategy, and it can be really hard to get more budget if, we don't have a ton of time at an organization. So what practices, I don't know if you can speak to them specifically, but what are some of the items that you've put in place to really help you to keep that um, data focus, and also what you're looking into as you continue to build out your team?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a constant struggle, right? Regardless of
Mhm.
what channel you're in. But there is also a lot of education that you have to do with executives around the company. Uh, I mean, a lot of times executives still have a somewhat outdated view that social media is free. You don't
Mhm.
need to put any paid behind that. You just go and post some things and people will read it. So making sure that they're up to date on, the latest in the algorithms and what your organic reach is actually going to look like, that you aren't just going to raise followers, but you actually have, other KPIs that you're reaching, and then kind of telling that story for them through the data points that you have of what it can look like to get that budget through social, as compared to if you put the budget to a different type of campaign. One thing at Northwestern Mutual that we really have to balance is like, how much money are we putting towards things like conversion campaigns versus how much money are we putting towards brand building campaigns? And there's trade-offs to doing either one. And you can do either one on social quite well, but it's just different. So having a really strong strategy overall at the company to know where the priorities are, making sure the executives that are making those decisions are well educated about what social can and cannot do for you. And then, just tracking and improving out that when you are given budget, that you're making the most of it and really turning around good, solid ROI.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think one of the things that we talked about earlier too was around, testing and learning, and of course, as marketers, we want to dive in and really understand the potential of whether it be a new platform or new focus within social. How are you balancing some of those testing and learning phases while still staying within, the guidelines that you have to work with? And also, do you feel like that, helps or hurts when it comes to having some of those extra restrictions and your, I guess, tunnel vision to make sure that you're staying on brand and having those conversations?
Yeah, it's a great question. At the end of the day, finance in the financial world, any regulated industry like that, we're just not going to be quite as nimble as like a CPG or retail company that can really, dive in with the newest thing. Whenever a new feature comes out, we have to go through testing to make sure that we can compliantly use that feature, make sure that we can track any customer information that comes in, make sure that it's retained for the regulations that apply to the insurance and financial industry. So, that does create some challenges there. And I think that the key then is not always just focusing on the shiny new object. Yes, we'll eventually get to, a spot where a new feature rolls out. It may take us a month before we're on it, whereas some brands jumped on it the very first day it was available, but we're going to get there. So in the meantime, it's about making sure that you are putting your best foot forward in the features and channels and whatever that may be that you do have access to. Because a lot of times people get very distracted by the shiny object when they're not even doing the basics right. So I think getting the basics really, really solid, that enables you to be able to go after those test and learn type things. Not to mention, when you're getting the basics right, your compliance team, your legal partners, all of those groups, they will have more confidence and allow you kind of a longer leash to play and test and learn, because they know that you're understanding the world that you're operating in. So it can be a challenge, there's no doubt about that, working in a regulated industry. But I think at the end of the day, it's just about definitely making sure that you're communicating and educating the wider stakeholders in your group, so you can all get to the best possible presentation of your brand.
Absolutely. I was just looking to see what questions we have. I think we may have time for one more, and I just want to make sure I'm being respectful of everyone's time.
And I apologize again for no video. We don't know what's going on for anyone out there, but it's not letting me turn my camera on today. I even put on makeup for you guys.
Well, we can still see your beautiful face on on the photo there. So, I think that the last and final question, really, and I think you are the perfect, brand partner to answer this is, when we look at any new or emerging brands
Mhm.
who want to build a legacy of their own, how do you recommend people um, look to modernize but not lose their legacy? And conversely, obviously, new brands, as they're building a legacy, how do they stay true to themselves through and through as they grow?
Yeah. I think at the end of the day, marketing can only go so far to help you build a legacy. It has to be about your customer, the product or service that you're providing for them, and how you're taking their feedback to make it better. So I would, my advice to any kind of startup or newer, younger company is, first of all, know your values as a company, know what you stand for, and live those values. And for Northwestern Mutual, that has been, I think, key to their success, because they are a company that for 165 years has really fulfilled that promise of serving their customers. But so I think that's step one, knowing your values, and then two, taking feedback. Nobody's going to get it right out of the bat every single time. So being in touch with your users, listening for what they're saying and what they're telling you. Often, they'll tell you without you even asking, as long as you're collecting the feedback. So that's maybe not squarely within the marketing realm, but I think those are things that I think of as key. You can't market your way away from lack of customer support or a bad product. You've got to take care of those essentials first, and then marketing is just the icing on the cake.
Agreed completely. And I think, some of those pieces that we talked about earlier, like, when we see brand content versus influencer content, a lot of the times the questions that you'll get are actually really insightful and can
Mhm.
turn into an entire conversation, with a net new customer. And so oftentimes we've used those to actually build out content strategy just based off questions or feedback alone. So I find that obviously you can't market your way, out of a specific situation, but you can certainly use those tools and features of social to drive potential changes within the organization too.
Absolutely. Living your culture, living your values, and being open to feedback and advice along the way.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Whitney.
Well,
Yeah,
thank
that
you
was
guys. And again, apologies for the lack of video. I don't know what's happening. I've been on Zoom calls all day with videos. So
yeah, so weird, but hey, it worked out anyway. And, so appreciate you working with us. And I know this happens, it always happens, and we're able to roll with the punches. So
World
still,
we live in
so,
now.
exactly. So still so glad to have you both here. Thank you so much, Whitney and Amelia.